Pulling a crime on a colony world should be easy. Less security, less people around, probably relatively inexperienced police. Well, sometimes other factors can play a role. Trouble with Time by Arthur C. Clarke. Read by Carl Wallace. We don't have much crime on Mars, said Detective Inspector Rawlings, a little sadly. In fact, that's the chief reason I'm going back to the yard. If I stay here much longer, I'd get completely out of practice. We were sitting in the main observation lounge of the Phobos spaceport, looking out across the jagged, sun-drenched crags of the tiny moon. The very rocket that had brought us up from Mars had left 10 minutes ago, and it was now beginning the long fall back to the ochre-tinted globe hanging there against the stars. In half an hour, we'd be boarding the liner for Earth, a world upon which most of the passengers had never set foot, but which they still called home. And at the same time, continued the inspector, now and then there's a case that makes life interesting. You're an art dealer, Mr. McCarr. I'm sure you've heard about that spotter bother at Meridian City a couple of months ago? I don't think so, replied the plump, olive-skinned little man I'd taken for just another returning tourist. Presumably the inspectors had already checked the passenger list. I wonder how much he knew about me. I tried to reassure myself that my conscience was, well, reasonably clear. After all, everybody took something out through Martian customs. It's been rather well hushed up, said the inspector, but you can't keep these things quiet for long. Anyway, a jewel thief from Earth tried to steal Meridian Museum's greatest treasure, the Siren Goddess. But that's absurd, I objected. It's priceless, of course, but it's only a lump of sandstone. You couldn't sell it to anyone. You might as well try to steal the Mona Lisa. The inspector grinned, rather mercilessly. That's happened once, he said. Maybe the motive was the same. There are collectors who would give a fortune for such an object, even if they can only look at it themselves. Don't you agree, Mr. McCarr? That's perfectly true. In my business, you meet all sorts of crazy people. Well, this chappie, name's Danny Weaver, had been well paid by one of them. If it hadn't been for a piece of fantastically bad luck, he might have brought it off. The spaceport PA system apologized for the further slight delay owing to final fuel checks, and asked for a number of passengers to report to information. While we were waiting for the announcement to finish, I recalled what little I knew about the Siren Goddess. Though I'd never seen the original, like most other departing tourists, I had a replica in my luggage. A border certificate of the Mars Bureau of Antiquities, guaranteeing that this full-scale reproduction is an exact copy of the so-called Siren Goddess, discovered in the Mare Serenum by the third expedition AD 2012. It was quite a tiny thing to have caused so much controversy, only 8 or 9 inches high. You wouldn't look at it twice if you saw it in the museum on Earth. The head of a young woman, with slightly oriental features, elongated earlobes, hair curled in tight ringlets close to the scalp, lips half parted in an expression of pleasure or surprise. That's all. But it's an enigma so baffling, it's inspired 100 of religious sects and driven quite a few archaeologists round the bend. For a perfectly human head, how no right whatsoever to be found on Mars, whose only intelligent inhabitants were crustaceans, educated lobsters, as the newspapers are fond of calling them. The aboriginal Martians never came near to achieving spaceflight. In any event, their civilization died before man existed on Earth. No wonder the goddess is the solar system's #1 mystery. I don't suppose we'll find the answer in my lifetime, if we ever do. Daddy's plan was beautifully simple, continued the inspector. You know how absolutely dead a Martian city gets on Sunday. When everything closes down, the colonists stay home to watch TV from Earth. Danny was counting on this when he checked in on a hotel in Meridian West late Friday afternoon. He'd have Saturday for reconnoitering the museum, an undisturbed Sunday for the job itself, and on Monday morning he'd be just another tourist leaving town. Early Saturday he strolled through the little park and crossed over into Meridian East, where the museum stands. In case you don't know, the city gets its name because it's exactly on longitude 188 degrees. There's a big stone slab in the park with the prime meridian engraved on it, so the visitors can keep themselves photographed standing in two of the hemispheres at once. Amazing what simple things amuse some people. Danny spent the day going over the museum, exactly like any other tourist determined to get his money's worth. But at closing time, he didn't leave. He held up one of the galleries not open to the public, when the museum had been arranging a late canal period reconstruction, but had run out of money before the job could be finished. He stayed there until about midnight, just in case there were any enthusiastic researchers still in the building. Then he emerged and got to work. "Wait a minute," I interrupted. "What about the night watchman?" The inspector laughed. "My dear chap, they don't have such luxuries on Mars." There weren't even any alarms, for who would bother to steal lumps of stone? True, the goddess was sealed up neatly in a strong glass and metal cabinet, just in case some souvenir hunter took a fancy to her. But even if she were stolen, there was nowhere the thief could hide, and of course all outgoing traffic would be searched as soon as the statue was missed. That was true enough. I've been thinking in terms of Earth, forgetting that every city on Mars has a closed little world of its own beneath the force field that protects it from the freezing near vacuum. Beyond those electronic shields is the utterly hostile emptiness of the Martian outback, where man will die in seconds without protection. That makes law enforcement very easy. No wonder there's so little crime on Mars. Danny had a beautiful set of tools, as specialized as the watchmakers. The main item was a microsaw no bigger than a soldering iron, had a wafer-thin blade, driven at a million cycles a second by an ultrasonic power pack. It would go through glass or metal like butter, and leave a cut only about as thick as a hair. Which was very important for Danny, since he had to leave no traces of his handiwork. I suppose you've guessed how he intended to operate. He was going to cut through the base of the cabinet and substitute one of those souvenir replicas for the real goddess. It might be a couple of years before some inquisitive expert discovered the awful truth. Long before then, the original would have traveled back to Earth, perfectly disguised as a copy of itself, with a genuine certificate of authenticity. Pretty neat, eh? It must have been a weird business, working in that darkened gallery with all those million-year-old carvings and unexplainable artifacts around him. A museum on Earth is bad enough at night, but at least it's, well, human. And Gallery 3, which houses the goddess, is particularly unsettling. It's full of bas reliefs showing quite incredible animals fighting each other. They look rather like giant beetles, and most paleontologists fight them that they could ever have existed. But imaginary or not, they belong to this world, and it didn't disturb Danny as much as the goddess, staring at him across the ages and defying him to explain her presence here. She gave him the creeps. How do I know? He told me. Danny set to work on that cabinet as carefully as any diamond cutter preparing to cleave a gem. It took most of the night to slice out the trapdoor. It was nearly dawn when he relaxed and put down the saw. There was still a lot of work to do, but the hardest part was over. Putting the replica into the case, checking its appearance against the photos he thoughtfully brought with him, covering up his traces might take most of Sunday, but that didn't worry him in the least. Had another 24 hours, and would positively welcome Monday's first visitors so he could mingle with them and make his inconspicuous exit. It was a perfectly horrible shock to his nervous system, therefore, when the main doors were noisily unbarred at 8:30, and the museum staff, all 6 of them, started to open up for the day. Danny bolted for the emergency exit, leaving everything behind. Tools, goddesses, the lot. He had not a big surprise when he found himself on the street. It should be completely deserted at this time of day, with everything at home reading the Sunday papers. But there was the citizens in Meridian East, as large as life, heading for plant or office in what was obviously a normal working day. By the time poor Danny got back to his hotel, we were waiting for him. We couldn't claim much credit for deducing that only visitors from Earth, and a very recent one at that, could have overlooked Meridian City's chief claim to fame. And I presume you know what that is? Frankly, I don't, I answered. You can't see much of Mars in 6 weeks, and I never went east of the Syrtis Major. Well, it's absurdly simple. We shouldn't be too hard on Danny. Even the locals occasionally fall into the same trap. Something that doesn't bother us on Earth, where we're freely able to dump the problem in the Pacific Ocean. But Mars, of course, is all dry land, and it means that somebody has to live with the international date line. Danny, you see, had worked from Meridian West. It was Sunday over there, all right. It was still sunny when we picked him up back at the hotel. But over in Meridian East, half a mile away, it was only Saturday. That little trip across the park had made all the difference. I told you it was rotten luck. There was a long moment of silent sympathy. Then I asked, "What did you get?" 3 years, said the inspector. That doesn't seem very much. Mars years. It makes it almost 6 of ours. And a whacking fine, which, by an odd coincidence, came to just the refund value of his return ticket to Earth. He isn't in jail, of course. Mars can't afford that kind of non-productive luxury. Danny has to work for a living, under discreet surveillance. I told you the museum doesn't have a night watchman? Well, it has one now. Guess who? All passengers prepare to board in 10 minutes. Please collect your hand luggage, ordered the loudspeakers. As I started to move towards the airlock, I couldn't help asking one more question. What about the people who put Danny up to it? There must have been a lot of money behind him. Did you get them? Not yet. They covered their tracks pretty thoroughly. I believe Danny was telling the truth when he said he couldn't give us any leads. Still, it's not my case, as I told you. Going back to my old job at the yard. But the policeman always keeps his eye open. Like an art dealer. Eh, Mr. McCarr? Why, you look a bit green about the gills. Have one of my space sickness tablets. No, thank you, answered Mr. McCarr. I'm quite all right. His tone was distinctly unfriendly. The surface temperature seemed to have dropped below 0 in the past few minutes. I looked at Mr. McCarr and I looked at the inspector. And suddenly I realized we were going to have a very interesting trip. The end.